Hello, I'm Brent Leatherwood, President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And let me first start by saying thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today to talk about an issue that's probably on your minds or will be on your minds, because the further we get into 2024, well, it's an election year, and maybe that fills you with a lot of excitement or a lot of anxiety. I don't know. But we're here today to just explore some of those things and get more in depth with questions centering around an election year to be a helpful and hopeful guide for you. Joining me today is my former colleague, professor at Southwestern Seminary and director of the Richard Land Center, Dan Darling. Dan, welcome back to Nashville, here to your old haunt at the ERLC offices.
Well, it's great to be back here, and great to be part of this and part of the great work that you're doing here and leading here at ERLC.
Tell our folks just briefly about the Land Center. What are you doing there?
Yeah, so the Land Center, as you mentioned, is named for Richard Land, who was president of ERLC for 25 years and served Southern Baptists really well in the public square. And this center is named after him, and it's really devoted to a couple of things. One, trying to train up the next generation of Christian leaders in all phases of life, whether it's the marketplace or the ministry or public service, and also help equip pastors and Christian leaders, as you do, how to think through the moral and ethical issues and how to steward their citizenship well.
Right. Well, we're certainly grateful for Dr. Land, grateful for you. And listen, let's just jump right into it. So it's an election year. How are you feeling about 2024 and just all that is with us here in this presidential election year?
Well, I'm feeling a couple of things. I think, first of all, I know this sounds counterintuitive in an election year where we've got, whatever perspective you're coming from, we have two fairly unpopular candidates and kind of a sequel that a lot of Americans don't want to see. Nevertheless, here we are. But I'm actually grateful. It seems counterintuitive to be grateful, but the fact that in America, we as citizens have the opportunity to, in some way, some small way, shape our government, shape public policy. There's a lot of Christians around the world who wish they had these opportunities. A lot of people around the world wish they had the freedom to do this. Nobody in Russia or North Korea or some of these closed countries is complaining about partisanship right now. They wish they had a little bit of that. So in one sense, I'm feeling grateful. In another sense, I think it's going to be a very divisive election. There's going to be a lot of important issues on the ballot. It's going to be a challenge, I think, for Christians to be faithful to what we believe and yet participate in our democracy.
Yeah. Do you think that Christians should look at this election year with trepidation, with anxiety?
I don't think we should. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of negativity. There's going to be a lot of partisanship, a lot of mudslinging back and forth, maybe even more than is typical. But I don't think we should look at it with trepidation or fear. We are the people that know God is gathering history to himself. God has made us for this moment. He is not in heaven wringing his hands over the things that keep us up at night. He has given us everything we need to live for life and godliness. And so I think we can both have genuine concerns about the state of our country and press into those with the way we vote and the way we speak up about public policy. And yet at the same time, we can believe Jesus' words when he says, be of good cheer, I've overcome the world.
Are there particular issues, just kind of like at a 30,000 feet level, that you as an individual voter, that you are kind of looking at or thinking about as we come into this election season?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues that are really important to, I think, someone like me and most, I think, evangelical Christians, Southern Baptists. I think the sanctity of human life is a big issue, and we're in a post-Roe era, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit later. But that's an issue that's on folks' mind. I think also, things like religious liberty, not just here in the United States, which is very important. There's a lot of religious liberty flashpoints that we're concerned about, particularly higher education and other places. with Title IX and other things, but also global religious freedom. I think also America's place in the world, and there's a lot of threats around the world in terms of Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. People are very nervous. And then also, I think economic issues. Evangelical Christians are also folks who care about economic issues and how those things resolve. And so I think those and more issues are things that folks like us are thinking about.
Sure. So we'll get into some of those very individualized issues that I'm sure that many people in our audience are thinking through. So before you engage those issues, do you think that there are hallmarks for Christian political engagement? Are there certain things that we are striving for that maybe other voters aren't necessarily animated by or have categories for? And if so, what might those be?
Yeah, in terms of, I think, issues that are of genuine importance to, I would say, evangelical Christians, Southern Baptists particularly, would definitely at the top of the list would be things like religious liberty. Can we protect our religious liberty here for the church to practice freely? I think we also care about the sanctity of human life. We also care about the culture itself, and where a lot of parents are nervous about the sort of march of the sexual revolution, some of the LGBT ideology that is sort of making its way through schools and other places, and are rightly concerned about that impact on the culture, on their children. And then also, as we mentioned, we care, American Christians care not just about the United States, but we care about our brothers and sisters overseas who are suffering persecution. And the U.S. has historically been a force for good for that, an advocate for those who suffer under tyranny, particularly religious persecution.
Mm-hmm. So think through some of those issues, right? And some of those particular areas that you spotlighted. We see the horrible attack of Hamas on Israel. We see churches being taken over and burned by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, several of which are Baptist churches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hundreds of which, actually. Closer to home, we see some aspects of our society taken over by, like a transgender ideology. Or we even see ballot initiatives that are lost in certain states to protect life. As you see these challenges out there, internationally and right in our backyard, what is it that you use to remain hopeful? And what would be a word that you could give to those Christians out there who see these things happening and we're telling them to be hopeful? Like, okay, well, what do you back that up with?
Well, I think if we put our hope in, anything but Christ, I think we're going to end up being disappointed. So ultimately our sure hope is in Christ. We believe that God is gathering history to himself, that he is sovereign over all things, that he is not surprised by the things that surprise us. That doesn't mean we should be passive. It doesn't mean we put our head in the sand. But I think it offers a realism in terms of we live in a fallen world, and there's a lot of good we can do in politics, but we know until he comes back to renew and restore the world, that things are always going to be like that. But again, we do have that hope that Christ is renewing and restoring the world. The other things that give me hope are I'm hopeful about the church. I think Christ has said he'll build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Anecdotally, I'm hearing from pastors around the country that are saying there's a newfound sense of hunger in their communities for people to come and hear the gospel. So our churches are growing, but then I'm also hopeful about this country. I'm an optimist when it comes to America. I believe that America has endured challenges before. We've endured hard and difficult times that we've gotten through. I think American people are good people, and I think we should be hopeful. I don't think, look, cynicism really sells today, but I don't think we have to buy it. We don't have to be customers.
Right. I will, let's focus in just briefly. Obviously, it's an election year. Political nerds like you and me, we're going to get excited at any point, because obviously we love seeing our fellow Americans exercise the powers that come from living in a participatory democracy like we have, right?
Right.
And yet, there are certain elements out there, individuals that get really wrapped around the axle about the election season. Where do you what do you think is the cause of that sort of emphasis on the pursuit of political power, and like where's that coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I as you know, and you have the same mind. I actually encourage Christians to get involved, and when I look at Scripture, when I see Jesus a command to love your neighbors yourselves, I think if we have an opportunity to shape the communities our neighbors live in and shape the policies that affect their flourishing, we should do that. I think part of seeking the welfare of your city, as we're told to do as exiles, that Jeremiah told the exiles in Babylon to do, is if we have an opportunity to steward our citizenship and help shape the policies around us. So I think politics is really important. Politics can be a useful vehicle for human flourishing, but it becomes a poor religion. And I actually think Christianity, when we follow Christ, when we have the spiritual disciplines, when we're attending church every week, when we understand how God is moving through history, it tempers our politics in a way that allows us to be involved and engaged, but understand that the limits of what we can do in a fallen world. And so we do care about elections, and we do want to see outcomes that affect the policies we care about. But we understand that even if it doesn't go our way, or even if we're disappointed by who is put in charge, that ultimately Christ is sovereign over all, and he is still on the throne. And I think that tempers our politics. And I think when we lose that, when politics becomes all-consuming, when it becomes everything, when it becomes our identity, then I think we're poorly served by it.
You said in there, we do care about elections, and we do care about outcomes. We also would add to that we care about leaders.
Absolutely.
And even leaders that we disagree with. Obviously, we are called to pray for those in authority.
Absolutely.
But you look around the public square right now, and it can seem, not always, but it can seem like there is a real lack of leadership with integrity. Thinking about leaders, how can we as Christians work to hold leaders to a higher standard? And how can we encourage people to run for office that do represent the standards that we would like to see in public office?
I mean, I think first of all, as you mentioned at the beginning, praying for our leaders is really important, and that's something that I often have to remind myself to do. You know, am I praying for our leaders as often as I'm complaining about them or posting about them? 1 Timothy 2, Paul urges Timothy to pray for everyone in authority. And let's remember, they're praying for Nero, who would send Paul to his death. He would be a martyr at the hands of Nero. And he said, you still need to pray for him. So much less, our American leaders, when we agree with them, when we disagree with them, and not just at the presidential level, but all the way down to the local level. To be in public office today, to put yourself forward, is to open yourself up to a lot of, abuse and a lot of just mockery and, sort of scrutiny of your life and all that. So anyone stepping forward, we should pray for. And then I do think we should prioritize not just the policies that leaders enact, but the leaders themselves in virtue and character. And sometimes, our choices are not great. And so you have to make a choice about a leader based on other issues. But where we can, I think we should prioritize character and virtue. And sometimes the nastiness of our politics compels Christians to say, I just don't want to be involved in that. Yeah. But I actually think that's a mistake. I think when good Christians leave the arena, it kind of cedes the field to other actors. And so we actually need good Christians, good men and women of faith, to step up and say, I see this as a calling. I want to run for office because I think God has called me to be in this place.
I think one thing I would pick up on, to maybe piggyback a little bit to what you said, we often think, look, we're having this in the midst of 2024. It's a presidential election year. There are a lot of races below that particular question on the ballot that deserve and really need Christian engagement.
Yeah.
In terms of policies, in terms of the personalities that are running. And one thing that we tend to underappreciate, I would say, in the church is the great good that can be accomplished at those local levels, through those local races, and helping to inform and speak to those candidates that are vying for local office. We underestimate how much our voice can really matter in those races that are closest to home. And oftentimes, if we want to change a policy or change the culture that we're living in, speaking into those races will accomplish a great deal more good than even at the presidential level.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, sometimes the entire focus is on the presidential race, and in some ways, there's not much you can do about that. It's sort of fixed, right? But there's a lot of things below that that we can have an impact on. Your state leaders, your local leaders, your school board, your local state representatives and state senators and mayors. And not just getting involved in running for these offices, but praying for them, getting to know them. If you're pastoring a church in a particular community, getting to know your local leaders and saying, how can we pray for you? How can we help you? And then also getting involved in trying to find good people to run for office. Running for office, being involved in politics is a way of loving your neighbor, of serving your neighbor. There's going to be somebody in these positions. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want someone of Christian character and virtue in these positions? Or are we just going to sort of leave it alone and see what fills the vacuum?
Right.
And often what fills that vacuum is not better than having a Christian there.
Yeah. I was actually in Texas, where you are now, recently, and was giving a lecture to a Christian college. And I did a little thought experiment with the audience that hopefully was a little revealing. Everyone could name whom the President of the United States is, Vice President. They could probably name who the governor of California was, or a congresswoman from Georgia. But you start asking them, okay, well, but who is your state representative for this area? Who is on the county commission for this area? The room started getting a lot quieter. And so that kind of leads to my next question. Where are Christians tempted in an election season? And how can we avoid that temptation?
I think there's a few temptations. I think the first we mentioned before, but I'll mention again, is cynicism. Cynicism about the church, cynicism about your fellow Christians, cynicism about the country. And look, there are deep concerns in America, but I think America is still a good country, and I think there's still a lot of reason to be hopeful about the country. So cynicism is not a virtue. I think number two, the abandoning of spiritual formation in an election season. I think of James 1:27, where he says, true religion is caring for widows and orphans and remaining unspotted from the world. And what he's saying is that there's an inside and outside dynamic, that our activism in the world is only ever as good as our life with God. And so it's tempting in a political season to be formed and shaped only by the presidential race or the politics, and that's sort of forming our hearts instead of getting time with God. And then I think the third temptation, and this is really important, is to allow a political moment or a political figure to divide us from our fellow brothers and sisters. Jesus, said that they would know you are Christians by the way you love one another. Francis Schaeffer, who was a great apologist in the 20th century, no shrinking violet, was unafraid to speak truth to the culture, be prophetic to the church. Nevertheless, he said that love is the final apologetic. He said, God has given the world the right to judge the validity of our faith by the way we treat each other. Yeah. And so let's, by all means, engage. Let's make arguments. Let's speak against evil. But let's not let minor differences with other Christians separate us. Let's determine and say, I am united with my brothers and sisters by something that unites us far more than should divide us.
Sure. It seems like in this culture that we're living in, the convictions that we hold fast to as Baptists, as evangelicals, as Christians, they're increasingly running counter to what this culture wants. How do you navigate that in the midst of making your decisions about someone who's running for office, a constitutional amendment that might be on a state ballot? How do you make sure that you are holding to conviction and yet still pushing forward in terms of helpful policy?
Well, I think, first of all, we shouldn't be surprised that to live as faithfully as a Christian is going to run counter in some way to the culture. Jesus promised us that, if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Now, in America, we have not really faced persecution per se, but true Christianity will always cut against the culture in some way. We're always going to be countercultural, and we should be prepared for that and not surprised by that. I think, secondly, we need to obey like what 1 Peter 3:15 and 16 says, to have an answer for every person for the hope that lies within us. So we need to answer the deep questions of the age. People are asking questions. What does it mean to be human? Why am I here? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? All these things. And Christianity has the answers.
Yep.
But then he says to do it with gentleness and kindness. And we can be both courageous and civil at the same time. The loudest person in the room is not always the most brave, right? And so I think that's the approach. And to trust that the Lord will use what we do to accomplish his purposes, that we should not get weary in well-doing. And, every generation needs to hear the message of the gospel. They need to hear the message of Christian ethics. And just because we've said it before, we need to keep saying it again and educate a new generation. And God will use what we do to change hearts. And, nothing is in vain.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciated most when you were here on staff, Dan, is you truly have a pastor's heart. And you brought that here to the team at the ERLC, and now we're placing a renewed emphasis on thinking through, okay, how can we best serve pastors? Simple question: what do you think a pastor needs right now in the midst of this election year and upcoming election season?
Well, I think pastors need prayer. I think pastors are, in the trenches. They're at the front lines, if you will, in our community, shepherding God's people. And I think a few things I would say to pastors, and I would say to myself when I pastored, is number one, you pastor the people that you have, not the people you wish you had, right? So 1 Peter says to shepherd the flock of God which is among you, the ones that you have. And so you may have a mix of people in terms of their political instincts or how they think about the election. And remember, you're their shepherd. I think number two, especially when it comes to the election, is we can't pretend it's not happening. So I think pastors need to address the election in the sense of, okay, folks, we all know this is happening. Here's how well we want to conduct ourselves as God's people. What does it look like to live out and steward our Christianity in this moment? God is not surprised by this moment. He's put us here in 2024 for a purpose. He has not put us in 1954 or 2124. He's put us here. And so how do we steward this moment? And then I think, three, I think pastors have a unique opportunity to shape the political theology of their people by really helping them see what issues really do come from Scripture that are issues that Christians can't bend on. And what issues are those things that good Christians will disagree about what's the most prudent way to address these things? Because I think if the church doesn't do this kind of work, our people are going to get shaped and discipled by other voices throughout the week. Some good, some not so good.
Right. And
so I think that's a role and responsibility. We don't need pastors to be partisan, but Christianity isn't inherently political in the sense that it is always going to cut against the idols of the age. Right. So I think that's one of the responsibilities.
So it sounds to me like at a basic level, you're saying, listen, don't turn your pulpit into a soapbox.
Right.
Don't just give it over to a candidate
right.
who's
right.
seeking office. Right. That gets into that sort of partisan nature of things
right.
that I think we all know we need to avoid.
Right.
But are there other ways that a church can be a helpful place for people to learn and get information about an upcoming election? And have you seen that played out in a helpful way in your own time?
I think so. I mean, I think as you said, we don't need pastors to be pundits. People can get that Monday through Friday, that when they come to church, they need to hear a word from the Lord. So that's the primary thing. But we shouldn't act as though our Christianity doesn't affect this one area.
Right.
If Christ is Lord of all, he's Lord over our politics as well. And so I think first, equipping people on how to conduct themselves as Christians in the political arena, that when you're in the political arena, you're still a Christian. Two, what are the key issues that you should be on the lookout for and that you should care about? And then I think also equipping people to go into the political arena in the marketplace. As a pastor, you may have people in your church who are thinking about running for office or thinking about stepping into those spaces, or they may already be there. And you can be an encouragement to them to use their gifts in those places that really glorifies the Lord. And I think there's resources that they can find if they have questions, individually, and how do I think about this candidate or this candidate? I don't think that's something you do from the pulpit necessarily, but there are other ways and forums and ways that churches can equip people.
Mm-hmm. I'll give a real life example also just to underscore that from right here in Tennessee. You may remember this when you were working here at the ERLC. In 2014, there was an amendment on the statewide ballot here that was a pro-life amendment. And, 6 weeks out from the election, it looked like that pro-life amendment may actually not pass.
Right.
And I remember there was a concerted effort that the ERLC helped with, the Tennessee Baptists here under the leadership of Dr. Randy Davis, and others got engaged to make sure that Southern Baptists across Tennessee were informed about the opportunity that this amendment presented for Christians. And it played out in a couple of ways. Some pastors early that fall decided to do a sermon series on the Imago Dei and the implications and the responsibilities that come from all of us being made in the image of God to their congregations. Others hosted on Sunday evenings, almost like informational sessions, so that folks could come and learn about the issue. And then others decided to construct some emails to help their congregations have a resource as it got closer to Election Day. I mean, all of these things happened, and I think they were all very helpful for folks who wanted to know more about that issue. Let's talk about the issue of life. We are obviously now in this new post-Roe era, still moving from a culture of death, where the pro-abortion industry was able to target vulnerable mothers and scared fathers and convince them that taking the life of their preborn child was the only way to move forward. So we now have this incredible opportunity to fight for life. When we think through this new moment that we're in, what do you think are the best ways for Christians to be champions of life and really take advantage of this new opportunity since Roe is now gone?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways we got to think about this moment. One is when the pro-life movement first started in 1973, the people that were the first sort of organizers of the pro-life movement, they understood this was a long march. They understood what was ahead. They had to make arguments to the culture. They had to put the infrastructure together. They had to educate people about this. And it took 50 years to overturn Roe. And I think it's going to take a similarly long time to get to a place where America is a culture of life. There's a few things to think about. I think number one, we have to continue to make the moral argument. We need to remind people that what we're saying is there's a life here. There's a beating heart. There's unique DNA. There's a life here. And we got to keep making that argument and saying, if we are a nation that says all men are created equal, then we need to live up to that as Americans. And so continue to make the moral argument, to teach. Part of what we do with our activism is not just trying to get laws passed, which we are, but make the argument and using all the persuasion we can. We cannot forget persuasion. There's new generations coming that have not heard the pro-life argument.
Right.
We have heard it our whole lives. We think, okay, we've done that. We can move past that. No, they have not heard the arguments. And it's our responsibility to do that. I think secondly, we need to take the long view that every justice movement is a long movement, right? William Wilberforce, when he ended the slave trade in Britain, he understood it was going to take his whole life. It did take his whole life, his entire life.
Yep.
And so this is a long movement. I think number 3, we gotta really keep pushing and take every possible win that we can. Every group of babies that we can save that's in front of us, that's possible, whether it's through legislation that we can build consensus and get passed, whether it's through crisis pregnancy centers that ERLC helps put ultrasound machines in to help save babies by convincing mothers to keep their babies, and by continuing to make the arguments about this. So I think that's very important for us not to grow weary in well-doing. We have a long march ahead of us. We also just can't assume that just because people vote with us conservatively on a number of issues, that they are pro-life, right? I think we're seeing that in places like Ohio and other places where it's a red state, but the pro-abortion amendment won. And I think there's a lot of folks that are in our coalition that have not heard the pro-life argument. So we have to continue to do that and then make our arguments. And then I think, as President George W. Bush would say, we have to build a culture of life that respects life at every stage of life, from the earliest baby in the womb to folks at the end of life, that has a consistent culture of life. And keep pushing the argument and not be afraid and not be embarrassed to be pro-life, to say, though, this is something I'm proud to be. We want to push that and push our elected officials to see this. And so it's a long movement. We should not be weary in well-doing, but I do think we're doing the right thing. This is the Lord's work, and we should not quit.
Are there issues that circle around abortion? Maybe they're not directly about abortion policy, but maybe issues around it that you're kind of paying attention to across the country right now?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think obviously I want to make clear that, the pro-life issue in a sense stands on its own, right? So all the arguments for it in terms of economic and all those other things, they are factors, but we should not be ashamed to say, no, I'm pro-life, and I don't have to have caveats for not wanting unborn babies killed. At the same time, I think if there's ways that we can do things to stabilize families, to stabilize young women in crisis, to make that environment better so that they see more options, that they see that bearing a child and being a mother is a good thing, is it going to be good for their flourishing, I think are really important. And I think pro-life folks are talking about a lot of different things, ways to help mothers in crisis, whether it's economically or financially or other ways. I think the Crisis Pregnancy Center movement is really doing a good job of that, getting around mothers and stuff. But there's probably legislation. Some states have already done this, right? I know Governor DeSantis in Florida, when they passed the pro-life legislation, they also, and we do this in Texas too, like give free diapers and free counseling and some child care and all these kinds of things so that when the mother has the baby, they understand, okay, there's a community around me that's going to help me raise this child well.
Yeah. I would add, we're obviously trying to stop the proliferation of this idea of abortion tourism, right?
Yes.
Where individuals are attracted to these locations to destroy life.
Yeah.
We obviously want to stop that. And then just maybe a couple more degrees removed, the ability for Christian families to be able to adopt in ways that are consistent with their convictions and not have the state tell them that they can't do that.
Yeah.
Those are a couple of other issues that I would say they're just kind of circling around life, but ultimately they get to your point. This is how we establish a true culture, true culture of life. Stop these avenues of destruction and allow Christian families, evangelical, Southern Baptists, to be able to adopt in ways that are consistent with Scripture.
I also think what's related to it is the stabilizing of the family. We're in an era where more children are born into unstable families than really any time in our history. It's a massive social experiment that we're doing that's not going well. And Dr. Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia has done so much great work on this. And in his new book, Get Married, he talks about just the importance of marriage and the importance of children growing up with a mother and a father that really sets them on a course for life. And I think that issue is not unrelated to the abortion issue. And so I think churches actually have a unique ability in their communities to help promote healthy family life, to come alongside families, come alongside single mothers and let them know, hey, we're here to help you raise your children to love the Lord.
Yeah. Well, so we've had a good conversation here about the protection of innocent life. And I guess I want to use that to segue into something that's not quite as close to home, but international. We have these conflicts, these hotspots around the globe, whether it is Ukraine or Israel, or even the threat of violence, maybe that China holds over Taiwan. Why do Southern Baptists care about these international zones of conflict?
Well, it's interesting. We just did a survey with Lifeway, and we found that among the issues Southern Baptists deeply care about, Southern Baptists in the pews, are global religious freedom, religious freedom for brothers and sisters overseas, and that America has a strong defense. And I think that's exactly right. I think America's in a position, God has put America in a position where when America is engaged in the world, it's better for those who are seeking freedom, right? Now, we can't be the world's policeman. We can't go into all these conflicts. We have to be wise and steward our resources well. But when we retreat from the world, what fills that vacuum is often worse. And I think we're seeing this around the world, whether it comes to Russia's encroachment on Ukraine, that if we allow Russia to kind of run roughshod through Europe, that's terrible for Europe. It's terrible for religious freedom. You know, Ukraine has the largest concentration of Southern Baptists or of Baptists and evangelicals of any country in Eastern Europe. It's been a hub for evangelism and discipleship. Our brothers and sisters who are in Russian-occupied territories are often treated terribly. We've lost 300 to 400 Baptist churches. And so we want the United States to be strong on behalf of those who are being persecuted. But then you think about the horrible situation that happened on October 7th with Hamas slaughtering Jewish people in their homes. And Hamas, we know from their own words, their goal is to not just wipe Israel off the map, but they want to kill Jewish people everywhere.
Right.
And so it's a really, really horrific situation. We have to stand on the side of Israel, who is a democratic country, who is fighting for their survival. Jewish people, unfortunately, in every generation have had to fight for their own survival. We need to be on the side of Israel. That's historically, America's done that. And I think that's the right thing to do. And then, of course, obviously, the threat of Iran. You know, Iran has designs on, they're an enemy of the West. They don't like our values. They don't like what we stand for. They don't like Israel. And so I think all those nations, unfortunately, the world is really aflame right now. You got Russia, Iran, North Korea, China. And if we don't stand up to them, along with our allies, then it'll be bad for the world. When America retreats from the world, it's bad for human flourishing. It's bad for freedom. We've always stood on the side of freedom-loving nations.
Right. Are there any instances in your mind where the SBC has taken a bold stand when it comes to individuals being persecuted internationally or global zones of conflict where the SBC has made a strong stand, where it made a difference?
Why, I think so. I mean, I think, first of all, in the 20th century, Southern Baptists stood up against communism, and we stood up for those who are seeking freedom, those who were imprisoned by communists. But I also think the SBC has always been strong on behalf of freedom-loving nations, but particularly for those Christians who are being persecuted for their faith. Our presidents, whether it's Dr. Land and others, have served on the Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's always been a hallmark of Baptists. Baptists are a global people, right? Our people in our churches go on mission trips to these places. They care very deeply about missions. We're a missionary denomination. We're a sending denomination. We love our country, and we're proud of America, but we also care about the expansion of the gospel around the world, and we care about our brothers and sisters. You know, we don't want to just tell our brothers and sisters overseas under persecution to be warmed and filled. We want to say, well, we're going to use our voices here in the United States to petition our government to do whatever it can to alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Christ.
Right. Recent examples I would point to, just kind of piggyback there, we called what is happening to the Uyghur people in China a genocide.
Absolutely.
We're the first network of churches, first denomination to do that. And that carried a lot of weight in Washington, D.C. 2022, in the aftermath of Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine, we passed a resolution standing in solidarity with the Ukrainian people and asking for Russia to be opposed because we condemned it in the strongest possible terms. So those are just two recent examples, and that just builds on the history that the SBC has had of speaking out when these atrocities occur around the globe.
We don't want to also forget our brothers and sisters in Nigeria who are being persecuted, slaughtered many times. Brothers and sisters in places like Sudan and other hotspots where Christians are just being slaughtered and persecuted for their faith.
Yeah, we have sent letters to the administration registering our deepest concern that Nigeria is not on a particular watch list because of the ways that they are treating Christians and other religious minorities there. All right, so you mentioned that we are a sending organization, right? We truly do want to take the gospel to the uttermost ends of the earth, and I would say that includes the public square. It's not just internationally, but it's also the public square. The ERLC, we view the public square as a mission field. What would you say to individuals who are maybe in ministry and leadership or in the pews who might feel a calling to run for office? What sort of encouragement and counsel would you give them?
Well, first of all, I would encourage it if that's something that God has called them to do. I would make sure that they really pray and seek the Lord and say, is this your calling for me? To get advice from your pastor and those close to you. I would also say to count the costs, to know that when you step forward in the public square, you're going to be immediately, attacked from one side or the other, to know what you're doing. But I also say it's a noble thing. I know a lot of times we sort of are dismayed at our politics, and there's a sense to view, okay, all politicians are bad and all politicians are, but I really we should encourage Christians to step forward. It's a calling. It's a noble task to do. It's a way to love your neighbor, to serve the Lord. So I would encourage them to do that. I would say to continue to not neglect your spiritual life, your spiritual formation, to not get sucked into the vortex of politics so much so that you neglect your walk with Christ. But I know many brothers and sisters, as you do, who are in that space. It's not easy, but they're faithful Christians doing the best work that they can. And I want to encourage that. I think we need good, decent, spirit-filled Christians in the public square, because if we don't, what fills that void is often we know is going to be it's going to be worse.
Right. A recent survey came back, and two of the top terms that Americans use to describe the public square were division and dysfunction. And I'm curious if this strikes you. When I walk around my neighborhood, talk to my neighbors, or go to my son's Little League game, and I'm at the ballpark and talking to people, those aren't the words that I would use to describe folks in the community.
Right.
What can we glean from that?
Yeah, I think our politics and our politicians are more divided than actually American people are. I think we have a sense that Americans are divided. In some ways we are, in terms of our, the presidential race is really close and those kinds of things. But as you said, when you're walking around your neighborhoods, when you're in your churches, you sense people are getting along even though they have differences. And I think we should encourage our leaders to do that. Look, I think a leader who runs for office should fight as hard as they can for what they believe and for good public policy. But in the end, having fought as hard as you can, get as much of what you can pass, but also to view your opponents not as avatars or the enemy, but as people made in the image of God who have dignity and worth. I mean, Peter says famously in 1 Peter 2 to honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So you see the ordering there. Honor all men, meaning every single human being deserves some respect because they're image bearers of God. You may not agree with them, you may oppose them on policy, but they're human beings, right? Love the brotherhood means our brothers and sisters in Christ deserve a special kind of love. We're in this new family of God. So we love our brothers and sisters, right? Paul says, be good to those, especially of the household of faith. Then it says, fear God, honor the king. So we don't have to fear the king. We don't have to fear those in charge. We fear God. And I think if we only fear God, it keeps that ordering in line, right? We fear God. We honor whoever's in charge, even if we disagree. We honor our brothers and sisters, or we love our brothers and sisters, and we honor all people. So I think having that kind of ordering of the way that we conduct ourselves is really important.
Yeah. Well, so last question. I started off talking about the fact that there may be some people out there that are apprehensive about the fact that this is an election year. They may even be filled with lots of anxiety about it. You and I aren't usually like that. We're pretty optimistic,
Right.
Glass half full Christians. But I'm curious, where do you go for hope in these sorts of discussions, talking about politics and policy matters? Where do you go as a source for hope?
Well, I think, first of all, this sounds like a cliche, but our spiritual disciplines really matter. So every week, going to church on Sunday, interacting with the people of God, hearing a word from the Lord, singing songs of worship, just kind of recalibrates our hearts. I think, secondly, looking for signs of hope, even in despair. Even when it looks like our politics are miserable and there's all these things, you can always see pockets of hope in the world, even as things are not great. And to know that God is at work. I think sometimes we've convinced ourselves that God's best days are behind him, that the Spirit is not at work in the world, and that Christ doesn't save anymore. That was just in the past. And the truth is, none of those things are true. Jesus still saves, God is still at work, and the Spirit is still alive. And so looking to see where God is working, to look up and see where God is working. I think of, times, even in American history, where things were bad and there was a sense of renewal. And it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen in the country, right? But I think looking at those things. I also think reading history. As you know, I love to read American history. It's kind of my hobby. But reading history gives me a sense of things. Like, okay, we've been here before. We're going to be okay. Also reading church history. This is not the first time where Christians have been in conflict. This is not the first time there's been divisions in the church. And then obviously reading scripture to know that God is gathering things to himself. Being optimistic doesn't mean we're head in the sand and we don't see what's on the horizon and we don't have concerns. But I think putting our faith in God.
Well, I love what you were saying about history. I probably the one of the biggest benefits I would say about history and reading history is it's not social media. It's not just shouting into the void,
Right.
Emotive in the moment. There's even a benefit, I would say, of reading a physical newspaper.
Yes.
Just because it's had some time to sit and it's
Right.
not just, fresh off of whatever somebody wants to be outrageous about or
Right.
sow grievance about. But I think history in particular, you can start learning and pulling out those lessons from history, and it gives you great perspective. And
It really does.
And ultimately, as Christ followers, we know who the author of history is.
That's right.
And I think it is incumbent upon all of us to honor him in all that we do, and particularly in an election year. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation with Dan Darling. Dan, I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for all that you're doing at Southwestern. And I hope each and every one of you have been helped by today's conversation, and not just helped in some transactional way, but in a hope-filled way.